I'm Marie Harvey, Associate Dean in the college, and I'm delighted you're here. And I'm going to introduce David Rothwell, who is an associate professor, and he's the Barbara E. Knutson Endowed Chair in Family Policy. Got it? And he has graciously agreed to moderate the session and to introduce our speakers. He is also very familiar with the topic today because he serves as a member of the guiding team. So I suspect you'll learn more about that as we get going. So with no further ado, David, I'm passing it to you.
Thank you, Marie. And what you didn't mention is that you're also a member of the guiding team too. So a topic you know very well. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to read the instructions here that will get us started. So welcome to the seminar. We are glad you could join us, especially for our last one of the term. It's a busy time. We have participants here on site, but also on Zoom. If you are joining us via Zoom, please note that for security reasons, this is a webinar and your microphones will be muted. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature and I'll be monitoring that, and so we can get to that at the end. So please do engage and ask questions, okay? So that's the guidelines. Now to introduce Jonathan and Kate. So Dr. Jonathan Garcia is an associate professor of global health in the college. He is the core director for youth and adolescents at the Hallie Ford Center, and his research uses innovative and participatory methods to develop public health interventions and inform implementation of clinical trials. He is also, with Kate, the lead or the directors of the guiding team for this project. Associate Professor Kate McTavish is Associate Professor of Human Development Family Sciences in our college, and her research centers on examining how small towns and rural places function for the children and families who call them home. She is also the newly elected president of the Faculty Senate, and of course a director of this project. And we're very excited to talk about this topic. It's really, Jonathan and Kate asked me to mention at the beginning that this is part of a major team effort, that they are representing a broad team that is really taken on the challenging goal of changing the culture and transforming the culture of our institution and our college to one that values social justice and equity in ways that we don't right now. So change makers and good friends of mine, turn it over to John and Kate.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Kate, Marie, Erica, Allison. All of us are part of the guiding team, and there are several others from the guiding team who weren't able to be here or who might be online, and we'll show you the whole map of what our guiding team is. Basically, this is the group of people who are in charge of figuring out what we're doing, putting together a strategic plan, and mobilizing and creating ownership and buy-in around justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so it's a very important group, and the key fact is that we're all doing it together. And so thank you for emphasizing that, David. And so that's also emphasized by our title, which really says coming together to advance equity and justice in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences as part of our land grant mission. And there's already a little bit of irony in that land grant mission because of the tension in our history as a land grant university. And you've all been familiar with opening of presentations with this statement that we're located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Apinefu Band of the Kalapuya. And following the Willamette Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed from this land to reservations in Western Oregon. And today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde community and the Confederate tribes of the Silex. And so, although we really we acknowledge that very often in our presentations, in our meetings, it's important to see that tension and the fact that we celebrate our land grant mission frequently, and we talk about being an extension and reaching every community throughout the state. There's a tension between whose land this is really, and whether the people whose land this actually belongs to are represented in our efforts as a land grant university. And so that's one of our goals, just to put that out there. And so this is an overall response to a call for proposals from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is really trying to, as it states, unpack, understand, and shape the contextual and intervening conditions necessary for underrepresented scholars to thrive professionally and personally, and in turn be better able to contribute to and expand health equity related research and evidence that can build a culture of health. And so the overall purpose of the Transforming Academia for Equity project is to determine what we are going to do strategically to make this college realize its goals and its mission. And so it's a big, lofty goal, and we only have 18 months to do it. And we're bound to find some important action items, but it's just the beginning. And so at least we have the ability, the FTE, and the focus to make this important beginning, because we've wanted to have this conversation for a long time, and Kate has made several proposals to different institutions, and finally we reached an institution that was able to support us in this important effort. And so in this process, we'll be having some very brave and, of course, uncomfortable conversations, and that's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. As I mentioned before, this initiative is driven partly by Oregon's history of racism. And we all know that from looking around that Oregon is a predominantly white state, and OSU is a predominantly white institution. But we also have to recognize that, and this I will also read because it's a very nicely written paragraph by Dr. Allison Myers, who prepared it for our proposal. And there are some vivid depictions about racism in our history. It says, Oregon's historical and social political context presents a major challenge for recruiting and retaining scholars who identify as BIPOC. In June 1844, when Oregon became a state, the provisional government included a Black exclusion law. The law stated that Black people who tried to settle in Oregon would be publicly lashed every 6 months until they left the state. By December 1844, the law was changed to substitute forced labor for lashes. Additional exclusionary policies continued to be enacted, including an 1849 law prohibiting Negro and mulatto children to enter or reside in Oregon. In 1857, new Black residents were banned from residing in the state. All Black people were prohibited from owning real estate, making contracts, voting, or using the legal system. In 1826 and 1827, the exclusionary clause was removed from the Oregon Constitution and voting rights were restored. By 2002, all races language was removed from the Oregon Constitution. So you notice also a historical moment in around late 1850s, 1860s, at the same time that the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, that we got our land grant to build this institution. And so there's a real parallel in the exclusion of Native Americans from their land, as well as the exclusion of Black people from Oregon. So it's really important to sit with those words, especially words like lashes, because those are reality. And so those have a real impact, not just historically, but today. We see that health disparities are driven by the kind of systemic mistrust in institutions, and especially about medical institutions, that is driven by this history and intergenerational trauma that are experienced by BIPOC communities. And I saw this, for example, in recent work that I did with Latinx communities around vaccine hesitancy, believing that they would be forcibly sterilized, perhaps, if they were vaccinated. And this is not unfounded because in Latin America and in the United States, Latinx people have been forcibly sterilized. So it's not a fear that comes out of nowhere. And so we see this also in mentions of Tuskegee and in the reluctance to engage in clinical trials by Black people in the United States and other instances as well, especially historical mistrust in its role in substance use among Indigenous people. And so this is something that has implications for today. And so we have to really grapple with it. The other thing that I want to emphasize here is that communities, BIPOC communities, don't just have health disparities. We are people with pride, we have culture, we have assets. And what's really important for us to look at is to build these community level assets in order to address these health disparities, not just deficit thinking. Oh, and these photos. Yeah, these photos are really important. And so when we were preparing part of this presentation for a meeting with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, or looking for photos about our land grant mission, and I found these over here on the page about the 150th celebration of our land grant mission. And if you look at that page, it's from marketing and communication at the university level, you only see white people. There's only some mention of women. Of course, the women that are shown on the page are white. And there's a celebration of discovery as a land grant university. There's no mention of the contribution of people like the ones you see here. These are photos from Pekun, one of the CBOs in our state that advance farmers' rights, farm workers' rights. And there are frontline workers and migrant farm workers that contribute to our food and contribute in many ways to our culture. And so what we want to see is the land grant mission to respond to and to include people from our state, including BIPOC communities. And that's just a really clear visual depiction. And so we have, although there's so many problems that we have to grapple with, we also have a lot of things that we've done well, right? And so the reason why David and I are here, as well as Cynthia Mojica and Stephanie Grutzmacher, is that hiring initiative in 2015, 2016, 4 of us came on to advance the goal of student success through a lens of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we were successfully hired, and we have been able to advance our research, which is primarily focused on health disparities and in cancer, for example, or with working class families, or with Latinx LGBTQ people, or food insecurity. It's just to mention a few of the topics we've researched. And we also have worked with students as mentors. And so we do have some progress. It's really important. And the college has invested and created solidarity to address systemic problems, right? Of course, that means we still have a lot of work to do. And so although we have included justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our annual props, which is a great step forward, some of that involvement in equity, inclusion, and diversity went down because we no longer had FTE to be able to invest in it as the 4 faculty progressed throughout our careers, right? And so we weren't able to put the same effort we put into EID issues later on in the subsequent years when that went away. And that was primarily mapped onto some changes in leadership. And so one of the biggest questions as we wrote this proposal that we looked at was, how do we sustain efforts across changes in leadership? How do we keep an emphasis on EID when there are shifting school heads, or when there's shifting deans or associate deans? How do we keep the emphasis on EID as central, not just as a side thing? Because EID really affects everybody, even if we belong to the dominant categories. And so the other thing that I'd like to emphasize is the problematic STEM classification, which did not allow the College of Public Health and Human Sciences to participate in OSU Advance, which was a really great effort funded through the National Science Foundation. And the other thing that the STEM classification does is that it prevents international students from staying here 3 years. They have to find a job in 1 year and get sponsorship, because STEM classified degrees are allowed to stay 3 years, non-STEM classified degrees are allowed to stay 1 year. And so it makes it really difficult to find employment after their PhDs. And this comes from a conversation with international students about how difficult it is for them. And so that's something else we can take a look at. And we are also really grateful for the important role that graduate students have had in pushing forward issues of racial equity and anti-racist approaches, especially after the murder of George Floyd. And so what I want to do is also read a piece of a letter that they wrote to the college with really important and actionable items that we want to continue to carry forward in this effort as we make a strategic plan. And so I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs in the letter and then go through some of the items that they pointed out. I said, we want to address the ways in which that our faculty and leaders, particularly white faculty, can improve communication and guidance around current events centering on systemic racism and police violence. Our college and university has reacted quickly to the COVID-19 pandemic, yet there has been little discussion or reaction to the public health crisis of racism and discrimination that is unfolding on a national scale in real time. Graduate students need to receive formal guidance regarding their teaching or research in the context of recent protests and responses to the structural racism upheld in this country. And then the letter continues, is that we know systemic racism and discrimination persist in all of our country's institutions, including academia. So this is speaking especially to this effort. As part of an institution of higher education, we play an important role in and are responsible for dismantling systems of oppression. Now more than ever, we need leadership, both administrative and faculty, to provide meaningful guidance to graduate students on how to navigate both research and teaching during this historical time. We recognize this is a difficult time, and these are hard conversations to have, but we believe that leadership can lead by example. And so for us, it's a really important call to action from our students. And part of why we applied for the Robert Wood Johnson's call for applications was because we saw the critical need that was driven by our graduate students. And so this is to really emphasize how important that was to us. And we've seen this when Kay and I were writing a piece of the proposal. She found this historical document about how graduate student and student mobilization had been key with the Speak Out and other events throughout history in mobilizing change. So we want to thank you. And so here are some of the issues that were brought up in that letter. For example, the first one is something I've already discussed, and you can see how integral it is, acknowledging the history of racism in Oregon and how that impacts health disparities, and addressing that through our research and our work on a daily basis as a College of Public Health and Human Sciences. We have that as part of our DNA, right? We're a College of Public Health and Human Sciences that's part of this land-grant institution with that tension in its history. So we have that opportunity to become an institution that turns that land-grant mission on its head and really becomes available and drives the needs of our populations, including and centrally focused on our BIPOC communities. And so it also asks for us to provide a list of resources and action items that are being taken to support Black students, to develop events for BIPOC students and faculty so they can build community and expand their social support networks at a predominantly white institution. And so this is something to keep in mind when we talk about our second priority, to establish a learning community as part of this effort, to bolster mentoring supports for BIPOC students, adopt best practices for inclusive pedagogy in classrooms and in an effort to eliminate racist and problematic content, to develop specific steps or make known that what you're currently doing to hire more BIPOC faculty and recruit and retain more BIPOC graduate students. And so we've discussed this as a guiding team as well, the importance of making sure we are taking actions before we have this critical mass. This is something that's discussed in the literature, and we've had discussions about how do we get to this critical mass of BIPOC faculty and representation in our college when we don't have any Black people as faculty, for instance, or Native Americans as Black people. And so the fact that we don't have that critical mass does not mean we can't do anything today. We can work on changing the culture in our college to make it a welcoming place and a place that attracts people. And so that's something we've talked about as a guiding team already. And then the last is high quality training on bias, micro and macro aggressions, how to manage inappropriate behavior in class and lab settings for all faculty, staff, and graduate students. And so as a result of all of these factors that have led us to take action, we've had some really important and bold conversations with leadership. And I believe that leadership has taken an ear and has initiated action, especially in thinking about high quality training for everyone. That is mandatory. We've had those conversations, and I think there's definitely progress in that direction. There's also progress in having program competencies include EID principles in them. So there are several programs that have already changed their program competencies to focus on social justice, equity, and inclusion. We have a new course on racism and health equity that UMIA and the team that's developed the general BS in public health is coming online. So this is a direct influence of the graduate students who suggested a course. And so thank you for that suggestion. And of course, we have the Transforming Academia for Equity initiative, which has all of that work to do and more. And we're planning on really setting our course to be able to do that. And so I'll just go through just the 3 priority areas, and then I'll hand it off to Kate. Our first priority area, of course, is to reflect on our history, on the history of Oregon, but more importantly also on the history of the college, looking at the implementation and practices of different policies. For example, the policies set out by the curriculum committee or the promotion and tenure committees that were able to really assess how and in which ways racism has embedded itself in our DNA as a college, and then are able to then suggest changes that can be made as a reaction to that. We are planning on doing some surveys and interviews with current and past leaders in the college. And we're determining what those domains are currently and being guided by some of the academic literature that Kate will review in a few seconds. And we are hoping to have some facilitated workshops focused on bringing critical consciousness to some of these issues. And as part of our first priority was to finalize our guiding team. And so we've been saying this word guiding team. Basically the people who are going to get our hands dirty, really tap into all of our different networks. And so all of us belong to different areas of the university and of the college, and that was strategic, right? And so we have, for example, folks like Marie Harvey and Allison Myers who are connected to leadership and to OSU Extension and to research, not only within the college, but outside of the college. We have folks like Kate McTavish who are connected to Faculty Senate in really important ways, as well as to PPOL, which is the
President and Provost Leadership Council.
The President and Provost Leadership Council, in which both Marie and Kate belong currently, and a consortium of different leaders around the ID in the college. That is also a really important thing that we thought of. Then we also have several graduate students. Erika Carrillo, who's our program coordinator, is also on the guiding team as a graduate student and bringing that graduate student voice. We also have Frida Enenjok, who is going to join us as one of the students who is going to be guiding our strategic planning. And we're looking for 3 more students in that role. And so that's one of our asks. If you are interested in participating in this role, please contact us. And we're looking for graduate students, especially doctoral students. And then the also really important aspect to highlight here is the involvement of Dr. Ricardo Contreras from Casa Latinos Unidos, who is a member of our guiding team representing a community-based organization. And we're also looking for an additional 4 community stakeholders from other CBOs to play a role in our strategic planning. So we're building this team starting from our guiding team, but also including a few more students and a few more community organizations to really help us to expand our impact within our college, but also across the state. So that's really important to really think about as we're trying to realize this land grant mission. And I've already mentioned the 4 of us who are the people who were hired under the Provost Initiative, David, myself, Stephanie, and Cynthia. And so Priority 2 is to establish a learning community, and we're hoping to do this in months 7 to 12. Remember, it's an 18-month project. And the purpose of this learning community is really to answer to this need for a culture of belonging, and also to provide mentorship. And we have tossed around a few ideas about the importance of several kinds of mentorship. So not only a mentorship that's faculty to faculty or student to student, but also the importance of some vertical mentorship, faculty to student. And then we've also talked about this developing of this idea of systemic mentorship, or the mentorship between faculty, students, and a community-based organization. Because several of us, when we were coming on to develop our research programs to be successful in promotion and tenure, one of the big challenges is developing a successful research program. And for that, especially for health disparities research, you make partnerships with different community organizations. And one of the challenges that comes up with that, of course, is the systemic trust that exists, the systemic trust problems, right? Because the community organizations and the university are not necessarily initially partners. And so that relationship takes building and it takes time. And so this, with the hope of building this learning community, we're also going to be working on mitigating some of the systemic mistrust through systemic mentorship. And then our last priority is to formalize our strategic plan for months 12 to 18, and to identify key priority actions, establish buy-in, and of course, evaluate our success, and establish some mechanisms for sustainability, of course, taking into consideration that key problem that we identified earlier on about the changes in leadership and the loss of sustainability when there are changes in leadership, having ways to really make sure that JEDI principles, justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, are incorporated across changes in leadership is really important for us. And with that, I will pass it to Dr. McTavish.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a great introduction to things. I don't think we can overstate the level of excitement when we saw this new initiative from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation come through. There was just a buzz of emails circulating among the group about we have to apply for this. And of course, it came on the eve of winter break, and the proposal was due January 7th. So December something, right? Yeah. So and of course we had like 5 days, no, a week, 8 days to put it together. So it really took a big lift and a lot of folks working together to be able to come up with this. But it was also very, very exciting. So I was going to talk a little bit more about systemic racism in higher ed as sort of setting the context. And I think Jonathan has done a very good job of setting up how, in many ways, the way in which things originated in higher ed were really rife with racism from the get-go. So I mentioned the Moral Act that brought into place our land-grant institutions. But in many places in the United States, those land-grant institutions were exclusive to whites. So we saw soon after that a second wave of land-grant institutions established that were to serve people of color. If we look at those, it's the thing we've seen so many times where it's separate but not equal. There were differing curriculums in the land-grant institutions serving white students than there were in the land-grant institutions serving students of color. There were differences in the levels of funding as well. So in so many ways that just reinforced the divides that we already had happening. Some other ways that we see systemic racism show up in higher ed have to do with policies, standardized testing, which Jonathan had on a slide. We know the story from our college of getting rid of the GRE and really sort of looking at that and owning the fact that that was a very racist policy in our admission standards. And we took the bold step of eliminating that. And I'm looking forward to diving into the data to see what has happened as a result of getting rid of that barrier for students. We can also think about racism in the affirmative action debates that continue to today, and we can think about racism showing up in higher ed finance. So I had an interesting opportunity yesterday to discuss this with my undergrads who have repeatedly asked me, why does it cost so much more to go to school today than it used to cost to go to school? When we talked about the fact that there has been this disinvestment for the last 20 years from states, including Oregon, from funding higher ed. And that disinvestment has been reinforced with a shift philosophically from thinking about, as we think about the purpose of higher ed, and research bears this out. When we thought about higher ed as being really important to a functional democracy, it's a public good. Therefore, it's something we ought to be investing in. When we have moved to really lift up the narrative about social mobility, and I'm all about the social mobility piece. I've spent years studying the value of higher ed in enabling social mobility. But then we shift that to an individual good. And it's not too easy then to see how it ought to then be something that individuals are paying for rather than the collective good paying for it. So we really need to find a way to rebalance that. So I bring these bigger things into play, not that we're going to change higher ed finance with this project, but it's the context in which we're swimming around as we're trying to do the work that I'll describe coming up. David may change the higher ed finance with your expertise on policy. We're going to be very much focusing on faculty. So we ran across a wonderfully informative report that was a part of a special issue produced by the American Society for the Study of Higher Education. I may be getting that right, or the Association for the Study of Higher Ed, ASHE. And they did a special issue in 2015 on racism and racial equity in higher education. And so we have been doing some reading, looking for frameworks. How do we begin this work? Because it's a little bit overwhelming. And we ran across this reading that's been informative. And specifically what they did in there in one of the chapters was to think very clearly and pull together the research on how systemic racism shows up in the experiences of faculty in higher education. And they came up with these 6 different themes that will become sort of focal areas for our project. The first is racism in the academic pipeline. Then we have racial hostility in the classroom. In a related classroom experience, racial resistance to authority and expertise, racial marginalization and isolation, the racial taxation of excessive service, and racialization in the scrutiny of research agendas. So I'll break each of these down and sort of give a flavor of how we see ourselves perhaps approaching them. What I'm going to show you next is very much still in the work. We have a document out that our guiding team is responding to and thinking about right now. And of course, we'll be pulling on additional resources as we go. So the pipeline and what happens around recruitment. So we know that as much as we speak to and set goals for diversifying our faculty, we are not always as thoughtful and intentional and careful as we can be as we go about the hiring process, the recruitment process, the hiring process, the retention process, and the advancement process. And we know, as Marie, right in the front of the proposal, created a nice table for us that allowed us to really concisely express the lack of diversity that we have in our faculty, to the point where there were some lines with zeros on them, and we had to have a debate of, do we dedicate a line of a very short proposal to show a 0. So what we'll be doing in this area is really taking a look at our practices. So we do have a number of resources that have been developed by this President and Provost Leadership Council, for example, here at OSU. And we'll take a look at whether or not those as best practices are coming into play as we're thinking about recruiting, hiring, retaining faculty, and also graduate students of color. So we will be drawing on a lot of that as we make our way through. And I do anticipate we'll have some surveys for folks who've served as search committee chairs. We'll have some conversations with hiring authorities as well about those practices. And the idea here, of course, is not to be the diversity police, but to study ourselves and see how well we're doing and hold ourselves accountable to doing better. The second category is the 2 that have to do with classroom experience lumped together. And here I have a quote coming out of that document that I mentioned. I've come to understand that I do not have the privilege of walking into a classroom and having students assume that I am a capable and credible teacher. Nor do I have the privilege of walking into a classroom and having people assume that I have earned my position through hard work and determination. I have to be deliberate in the subject matter that I teach, so that others do not see me as an exception to their assumptions about who is qualified, about who has the right to be here. I would anticipate that for many faculty of color on our campus, this experience described rings true. So as we think about racial resistance and to authority and racial hostility, there's a large body of research that affirms that there are both covert and overt racial discrimination that happens in the classroom. We know that happens within our college from the reports we have from the bias response groups. There are challenges to the authority of faculty of color, and those challenges can begin on the first day of classes when students question their expertise, when students refuse to call them by their title, when they question their academic integrity and make assumptions that they are biased. In these situations, faculty of color can be forced to respond by asserting their authority, setting firm ground rules in the classroom that can make them seem harsh, being keenly aware of the attire that they wear each day that they're teaching, by identifying resources outside the classroom to bolster their credibility, for example, bringing in guest speakers even, and by discussing their credentials for teaching the course and subject matter very directly with their students, something that many of us don't have to do because our identities aren't questioned in that way, right? There are also examples of racial hostility happening in the classroom that can manifest in blatant disrespect, disruption, hostile language, and the like. There is some evidence that faculty of color are more likely than white colleagues to experience disrespect from students in a classroom as well. So we'll be looking at that. Posing these kinds of questions, how do racial resistance and of authority and expertise and racial hostility in the classroom show up in the experiences of faculty and graduate students in our college? And what efforts have we made to try to counter those? So we have the climate survey we conducted ourselves in 2016 to draw on. We also have the current climate survey that Office of Institutional Diversity is conducting. And I was just told this morning, I'm now on the analysis team this summer to come up with the results from that. We have our bias response reporting that we can draw on as well. We have had faculty who've engaged in anti-racist teaching workshops and other trainings who will bring perspectives on what it's been like to sort of work through that and examine their own teaching through that lens. And then we also plan to do some interviews with and surveys of faculty, perhaps. Again, all of these things are very much in the works. When we think about racial scrutiny of research agendas, this is another one that comes on strong. So the work, as Jonathan said, the community engaged or community-based work that many faculty of color do as a way of bringing their expertise back to their communities to address the inequities that exist there, often take longer in terms of developing relationship. Sometimes that hard work doesn't get counted as we think about promotion and tenure and annual review processes. We also know that sometimes scholars who are doing edgier work from a critical lens may be publishing in journals that are outside of the mainstream. So how do those get counted as we move into promotion and tenure processes? So we'll be looking at that, drawing on the resources that we have down here, thinking about who comprises our promotion and tenure committees, because that is an elected process. What do our policies and processes look like? Throwing words in there perhaps to think about who we're honoring and who we're elevating in our recognition mechanisms, and then thinking about the kind of training and the kind of theories that our students are encouraged to engage with, our graduate students in their training. This one, I saw a lot of nods when I mentioned it to start with. I think this is probably one that many of us are aware of. The idea that there is an excessive service load that comes either from being called in to be the representative on every committee that you're on. And when we are very thin in terms of the number of folks who are present within our community, that happens. There's also the extra benefit, but also service load that comes from having students seek you out as a mentor because you look like them, which is necessary. And when there are only a few folks of color, faculty of color, that load gets larger. So we may be doing some case studies, looking at service loads, but also documenting the positive impacts of what happens when we have faculty of color in positions on campus. Looking as well at how we think about workload and the allocation of FTE in different areas. And again, thinking about what we're rewarding and awarding, recognizing. Marginalization and isolation is another thing, and I think this came out very strongly, Marie. You remember in the reports with the President and Provost Leadership Council that when we do manage to recruit faculty of color and they come here, the stories that I was hearing and doing some interviewing for that report on retention of faculty of color, folks were saying, yeah, when I first got here, everybody was really friendly. They wanted to talk, and then before you know it, things were kind of falling off. I knew people were getting together and doing things, but for some reason I wasn't being included in that. So thinking about how we manage that within our setting as well. So trying to take a look at whether or not we do have those affinity groups that the students were calling for. Do we have cultural centers that help draw folks together and become welcoming places? And where are the places and spaces that we gather? So that is a little bit about the work we're going to be doing. And then we also wanted to offer up a call for action. Over the course of the next year and a half, we will be engaging with as many of the folks in our college as we can, the faculty, students, staff, community partners. And we really do see this as stepping forward, leaning into really a brave process of trying to transform our college. If you've got questions about the process, we're happy to answer those. We encourage you to practice allyship and solidarity with the BIPOC communities at work and outside of work. And of course, to think meaningfully about incorporating discussions and readings in your classes and labs and committees to advance the JEDI principles. So there are things we can do tomorrow, as well as things we'll be doing over these next 18 months. So with that, I think we're done. So thank you all who've come, and Jonathan's going to come back up now.
Oh, okay.
We can take questions. Just
Happy to answer questions.
Put it Q&A.
Okay, there's
Oh.
one question right here.
great. Thank you, Vicki.
So you talked about BIPOC professors having a higher load of students wanting them to be their mentor. Do you have any idea of how you would lighten that load?
Hire more BIPOC faculty.
Yeah, and part of that, and so that's part of the discussion that like I mentioned, critical numbers and having more BIPOC faculty is obviously the goal, right? But we might not be able to do that immediately. And so in the meantime, before we can hire and retain more BIPOC faculty, we're working on changing the culture so that students have more bravery to talk to their faculty mentor, regardless of whether they're BIPOC or white or another part of the dominant category. And so having that change in culture will allow for everyone to be equipped with the tools to be able to mentor all students. And so that's something that also changes the culture and allows us to be more effective.
Yeah. And then training for faculty as well, so that faculty who don't bring those perspectives necessarily immediately will have more empathy, more understanding. I remember mentoring a first generation student, and I come from a background where we've got waves of folks with graduate degrees in my ancestry, and just feeling, but I'm always ready, just ask me anything. I'm happy to answer questions. And she said, I don't even know the question to ask. That's the thing. So, yeah. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Do we have any questions online?
Not yet. You want to encourage it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if you, for those of you that are still online, the Q&A is there.
Yay. It's like we're going fishing. Fish on.
So we have just a comment, that thanks, and from Linda Pensky, so impressed, and thanks for the presentation. Any questions here? I just to keep us going here, can you tell us a little bit about, from your vision, how could this be, what would success look like, 5 years down the road? I think the critical mass issue would be addressed, but how might our college be different, in the future? I'm sure we're all thinking about what that could be, but from from your vantage point, what might that look like?
Can you repeat the question too in the mic?
Sure. So David has asked, what will success look like 5 years out from now? What would we envision our college will look like? And I think you, of course, pointed to the fact we will look more diverse, hopefully, or we'll be beginning to look more diverse. Yeah, I think the experience of students in the classroom will be radically different. I think that's been one of the hardest things for Jonathan and I to sit with is hearing again the frustration of students year after year about the fact that they still are having experiences with racism, overt and covert, in their classroom interactions. And why does the harm have to keep happening? So I think maybe we'll have that. We have made some good progress along those lines.
And yeah, and I have some thoughts about how to become like the hub for health equity in the state. I think our college has a lot of great opportunities to collaborate with what OHA is doing, what our community partners are doing through extension, and to really amplify the impact of the research that we're doing on and with communities throughout the state that are experiencing health disparities. And so I think that our College of Public Health and Human Sciences has that combination of public health and nutrition, kinesiology, HDFS that really is equipped to build something that becomes the hub for our state. And that's what we mean by fulfilling our land grant mission. I mean, it's really turning that land grant idea on its head so that we're able to effectively incorporate and include communities throughout the state. I think that's like our goal to try to achieve over the years. I mean, it might not be really easy, but I think that's a really good one. Marie? Yeah, would you like to add?
Yeah.
And please add also. Yeah.
Okay, I would just like to say, I would like to see in 5 years our P&T changed and are starting in our college and are encouraging and rewarding faculty who want to work with communities and understand that process slows down the current rewards or the current markers of being successful, and to come up with better markers of success to look more at the impact we're making. And so I think that's part of the incentive of basically hiring diverse faculty and retaining them. So that would be really something I'd be eager to work on, hopefully to help transform that. It's starting to happen. Things are moving that direction, so I don't want to discount that. But I think we have lots of work to do with that. And, I think those of us who work with communities understand the difficulty of actually doing a research project and publishing it in turning it around in a timely fashion. And so I'll stop with that. Do you want to say?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. I just want to, something that has come up in what Jonathan said and also what you said, Marie, is this idea of community connections, community relationships. And I know that's part of our project, but something that you didn't go too far in depth on. So could you talk a little bit about Ricardo's role, why that's important, and the community connections for the audience, who that will be valuable for? And then after that, we have a really good question from Laurel.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
And so Ricardo Contreras, who is the executive director of Casa Latinos Unidos of Benton County, has agreed to join us as part of our guiding team. And so we had already thought about the importance of including community stakeholders and community leaders as part of that, because I think that's the key to connecting to local communities. That's the key to knowing how we can contribute. I mean, we could, if we were going to be ineffective, figure out what the community needs and deliver what we think the community needs. But if we really want to listen to what the community needs, we need to have people at the table that are actually connected and working with the communities. And so Ricardo's role and the other 4 members of community organizations that we're going to recruit to work with us in this process is going to be exactly that, are ways in which we figure out what the community needs, how we can make an impact as a land-grant university with communities throughout the state. And I think maybe Dr. Myers can you say a little bit more about the work of extension and how that can have an impact?
The infrastructure you all provide.
Yeah, well, this is Allison talking. The Extension Service has offices in all 36 counties and a presence too on at Warm Springs Reservation. And so when I think about, I have a little note here for community stakeholders. And already in my mind, it's like, who is it? Which are the community organizations out in Eastern Oregon, for example, or at Warm Springs? Our extension faculty, there are 130 of them in family and community health, little known fact, faculty and staff, and they hold authentic, like equitable partnerships in community. And I think too often they're out in the field and not, physically or even in spirit with us on campus. And so part of this work, I think, will bring them in, draw them in a lot more and get us closer, right, to the folks who know exactly what they need. And then somehow we as academics discover it. And it's like, really?
Right, and then we put it in an
So,
article.
Then we put it in a paper and now suddenly the community,
Share it with each other.
yeah. Anyway, thanks for asking for comment.
Of course.
Okay, next question is from Laurel, who says, thank you, and thanks for the call to action. And then goes on to ask, when you showed your guidance group, what role do you think unions, UA, OSU, and CGE, and SEIU can play to help guide social justice to join the efforts to improve our learning and workplace? You showed PCUN as a great example of the solidarity that can lift all.
Great question. Yeah, of course.
I feel like I'm biased.
Yeah, that's okay. As long as you tell us you're biased.
Laurel, thank you for raising that. And that is another hat I wear. I'm one of our college's union representatives in partnership with Laurel and a few other of our colleagues. So great suggestion, Laurel. And I think that's something we can take back to the guiding team discussions and kind of chew on a little bit.
Do you have any thoughts on how unions on campus or otherwise could to the goal, or how would they fit in as a community partner, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that could be a possibility. I do know that through involvement with the union, there is a lot of training that is accessible to folks that are engaged with the union that very much is pushing to how do we take an equity lens? How do we work towards justice? It's just at the foundation of the union effort. So I think these more dialogue with the unions would be great, and maybe even figuring out how we can solidify that connection. Yeah, certainly thought partners, right? And taking ideas that we're having back out for discussion to get input on, perspectives on, right?
And implementation partners as well. I can imagine that because the union has such a big role in implementing faculty policy and changing policy to make it more equitable, that they would be very interested in hearing our suggestions and working with us to implement them. I think that would be an amazing implementing partner too. I can imagine that our principals are also very much aligned. And so we could also ask them to comment and work with us to develop our instruments for our interview guides, or because I think they could have some really good input in terms of what areas to explore. I think that would be great. Yes.
Hi, I had a question. Thank you. Besides the GRA that you guys took out for the admissions, what other things are you wanting or can you do to make OSU more accessible to BIPOC potential students who don't have the ability or maybe the support to attend college?
You have
Well, one way we're trying to figure this out is try to help get tuition, because it's expensive. Who you guys were talking about it, and there's a call right now from HRSA, and we're hoping we're writing for it, and if it gets funded, we will have tuition for 30 MPH students for each of them for 2 years. Of course, it has to get funded, so we can't count on it. But but that's just an example. I'm thinking of how do we eliminate barriers, and what are those barriers? And I know for one, funding is a huge thing, but particularly for not, PhD students, we really try to get them funding, but MPH and undergrads, we try hard for undergrads, but the MPHs have often been left out, I think, in our efforts. So that's one barrier. I guess, do you have other barriers that you think we should try to address?
Off the top of my head, funding is kind of the bigger issue.
Is that the big one?
Or I don't know, some people don't feel that they have enough schooling to go for it after high school. That's not necessarily the college's issue. It's more of a broader issue.
And so what is your name?
Elizabeth Garcia.
Okay, so Elizabeth has also said that some students don't have enough information or enough knowledge about what it would be like to go from high school to college. And so that's also a very good observation. And some of our work, like Mario Magana does, the Outreach Leadership Institute, and for underserved and minoritized youth in high schools throughout the state through 4-H. And so that's one example of the kinds of programs that Extension has been able to use to teach students and do college prep with Latino and Black students throughout the state. So doing that and amplifying it and making a part of what we do and really highlighting it, because I can imagine that many people haven't heard about the Outreach Leadership Institute or haven't collaborated. And Mario's always looking for volunteers to help and to give workshops at his Outreach Leadership Institute, having faculty participate in the OLI, the Outreach Leadership Institute, and having that count. I think the piece that really challenges it is when we have so many things to do, it's hard to participate in these kinds of things because they don't count. And so that comes back to how things are evaluated in promotion and tenure and what the system encourages and what it doesn't. Good question.
Okay, last call for questions for those of you online or here in the room in person. Yes.
Can you just recount your action steps? I heard something about looking for 3 students and 4 community partners, but there might be other sort of calls for involvement that you all want to reiterate.
We're going to be tapping everybody for involvement. So be ready.
And that's a great question. So 3 students, graduate students, to work with us in the strategic planning phase, and we have some funding to give hourly pay for students so that they're not working for free. And then also community stakeholders, additional 4, and they would also get a stipend. And so that's definitely an immediate call for people who are interested to email us and let us know. And then the other piece is the learning communities. So look out for, and responding to surveys or anything like that. Surveys are usually really difficult because they come at like awkward times and like all the emails come in and you're like, oh my gosh, why are you asking me so many questions? But if you can respond to the surveys in meaningful ways, that could be a really good way to contribute to this effort and to make it meaningful, right? The way to make this actually mean something is to participate in the surveys or interviews when they come into your email box. I think that's a big one. It might not seem really big, but it is. If we can get a good response, then we can actually get people involved.
We also forgot to mention that we are soon to have a JEDI office on the 3rd floor of Waldo Hall, and we will have a grand opening and let you all know when we have that. And that's going to be a spot to gather, to have good discussion, to have resources available for checkout and for folks to use. So, yay! Maybe coffee and more.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to wrap up here. Thanks, everybody. Let's give the speakers another hand here in person. And Thank you guys for helping us really think about how to realize the full potential of our college in meaningful ways. So we'll sign off the webinar and have a good day.